This is a great initiative from our Diversity and Humanistic Culture Committee to bring together faculty, staff, and students. And I'm honored to introduce for the first of 4 sessions, Dr. Jeffrey Gurian. We are so proud he is an alumni of Temple Dental School. He was a practicing dentist. He is also former faculty from NYU Dental School. He also is a comedy writer, director, author, producer, and radio personality. He also is a practitioner of spiritual healing and energy work. And those of you, students, faculty, staff, who know me know that I'm a yogi practitioner, and a lot of the things that Dr. Gurian brings to his presentations or will bring and his background is so valuable. Know that he is also the author of 2 best-selling books, Fight the Fear, Overcoming Obstacles That Stand in Your Way, and a spiritual and humorous approach to achieving happiness. And during these days and these times that we've experienced since last March, I can't think of a better way to spend this evening and the next 3 Wednesdays. So thank you, Dr. Gurian.
Thank you so much. It's really very special to be here. And I want to start out by expressing some gratitude to you for facilitating this and for Dean Ismail for coming up with the concept and approaching me. As you hear what I have to say, you'll understand why this is such a special event for me and such a rare opportunity. It's the kind of thing that you never expect to happen. I graduated, I hate to think of how long I graduated. I graduated before a lot of you were born. And the culture of the school was very, very different in those days. So I really have to give a lot of credit to Dean Ismail for literally changing the culture of the school. I guess I should start by telling you a little bit about myself. I wanted to be a dentist since I was 12 years old. I must have been a really strange kid. I wanted to be a doctor. I knew I wanted to be some kind of a doctor, but I already knew that I was too sensitive to be an MD, and I knew that I couldn't handle life and death situations, even at that young age. I was a very, very sensitive child. And that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing as we go, how to use sensitivity in our practice to help us become stronger. It's not a weakness, it's a great strength, but I didn't know that as a child. And I always felt that it was a burden to carry. I decided that I wanted to be a dentist when I was 12 years old, and I was already writing comedy and for the amusement of my friends. And it confused me because I used to think, how could I be a dentist and also be in show business? There's no such thing. And somehow I was able to manifest that. When I was 7 years old, I started stuttering. And I stuttered very badly through my 20s and beyond. When I was at Temple Dental, I was still stuttering and blocking on words. I made myself run for the president of the freshman class of Hunter College. It was a very big school. It was fed into by 7 different high schools. And I didn't know most of the kids, and I couldn't say my last name. I couldn't say Gurian. Most stutterers have a very hard time saying their own name. And the reason that I think, as an avocation, I now work with stutterers all over the world, and I teach them how not to stutter. But in those days, you know, I used to challenge myself. I learned very early on in life that I had to challenge my uncomfortability, because for whatever reason, and I still don't know why, but I grew up with a lot of fear. A lot of things made me uncomfortable. I grew up with a very supportive family, a very loving family, but for some reason I had a lot of fears, and I always felt that I had to confront them. So when I went to college, I made myself run for the president of the freshman class, and I couldn't even say my name. So I had to have other kids who knew me from high school introduced me to kids I didn't know and asked them to vote for me. And I told myself if I could win this election, that I wouldn't have to stutter anymore, because it would teach me that people liked me. I guess I had a feeling that people didn't like me, even though I was supposedly very popular in high school. I was voted, in those days, they did crazy things in the yearbook. They would have senior celebrities and they would have prettiest girl and handsomest guy. And I was voted most talented because I played the piano and the drums. And so, but I never really felt like I was part of something. So I made myself run for the president of the freshman class, telling myself that if I could win the election, I wouldn't have to stutter anymore. And it was a great lesson for me because I won the election and I was the president of the entire freshman class of Hunter College, and I still stuttered. And it taught me that outside validation in life doesn't work. It doesn't matter how many people tell you you're fantastic and wonderful and talented. It matters what you think of yourself. And my parents had sent me for speech therapy and no one was able to help me. And I realized one day that I didn't stutter when I was alone. I could go into a room by myself and I could speak fine, which told me, and I consider it grace now that I think about it, but it told me that you can't have a disability based on your location. If a man has a limp, he limps in every room of his house. He can't go into a room and close the door and walk perfectly. But if I could speak fine when I was alone, then theoretically it means that there's nothing wrong with me. It's something that I created in my mind through my thoughts. And that's something that we're going to be talking about a lot, about changing mindsets and changing thoughts. But this was one of the first times when I realized that I needed to change my thoughts in order to change my life. Stuttering is a terrible disability. When I applied for dental schools, I only applied to 3 schools. And I applied to schools that I liked the names of. I was very confused. I have really bad ADHD. In those days, they just called it ADD. It wasn't high definition yet. And it was just plain ADD. And I only applied for 3 schools. I applied to Buffalo, and my dad went up there with me for the interview, and it was too cold. I made it, but I didn't accept it. And I applied to Maryland. I think it's the oldest school in the country. And I went there and just didn't feel right. And Temple sounded great to me. I went to Philly. My dad came down with me and I liked it. I thought it was great. I lived in North Philly. I'm sure it's still there. And I was very excited to go to dental school until I got there. And when you hear how I connected with Dean Ismail, you'll understand how strange life can be and how you can never tell what's going to happen. I expected to be welcomed into dental school by the instructors, thinking that if you were joining their profession, that they would be very happy to have you. On the very first day of dental school, the dean made a speech and he said, "We don't want any free thinkers here. If you want to be a hippie with a guitar, go to dental school in California." And that kind of set the tone for what was going to happen. I wasn't really prepared for it. This was the late 60s and everything was, you know, the love generation. People just wanted to get along. There was no diversity, by the way. I'm happy to see that there's a diversity community at Temple these days. Everyone in my class looked the same. There was one woman in our class, and she went on to marry one of the instructors. So there wasn't a lot of diversity, let's say that. From my first day, I was picked on and bullied by the faculty, which went on for the next 4 years. I could have never expected anything like that. And it was really very traumatic for me. As a matter of fact, the dean put up, you know, I saw a couple of photos of you guys who were attending this talk. You would have been banned from school. I grew a mustache and I had sideburns. I'm actually going to show you a picture of me in dental school, if you can see it. This is me in the Temple University clinic doing something. I was banned from school for that hair. They said that my hair was too long. It didn't even reach my collar. It was, but because I had sideburns and a mustache, I was banned from school. Now, the head of the Crown and Bridge department in those days, I won't mention their names, but he had a Confederate flag in his office and a sign that said, "The South will rise again." Not a good sign at all. He was the main guy that banned me, and the guy who was the head of prosthetics was Pennsylvania Dutch, who looked like an SS officer, basically. And they told me in my junior year, I was not allowed to see patients for 3 weeks. They kept me out of the clinic. They said my advisor, in those days, I don't know how it is now, but we were assigned advisors. And my advisor took me out in the hall one day and he said, "I want you to know that you're a disgrace to the profession." And it hurts me to this day to say those words, that someone would tell that to a student in their early 20s, that you're a disgrace to the profession. They told me that I would never be successful, that I should consider dropping out of school. And I would tell my parents and they would say to me, "You know, if you want to drop out, we'll understand." And I said to myself, no, I will never do that. I will never give them that satisfaction because this is my dream. I've wanted to be a dentist all my life. And I pursued it. I'll give you an example. I copied this. The dean of the school put up a flyer all over the school and hung this on the walls. And I think that you'll be shocked because, well, I'll read you a little bit of it. He said, "This is a communication on the subject of hair, which I deem to be of timely importance. The public's current concept of a professional gentleman, especially in the field of health, pictures a clean, neat-shaven, well-dressed person of good manners. A century ago, the concept of that era included such items as beards, mustaches, long sideburns, tobacco chewing, greasy black alpaca operating coats, etc. Customs change, and it appears to the more responsible persons that the current concept of a professional gentleman is a marked improvement over a century ago. I do not know all the factors that are leading many of our handsome students into channels of personal grooming savoring of the past. It may be that the reissue of Gone with the Wind is partly to blame, or that the rebellion against the establishment has reached some of our students. At any rate, I am not enchanted by long sideburns, mustaches, and related items that indicate that there's a preference for conforming to a pattern other than the current concept for a professional gentleman." No mention of women. "Our dental students have long had the reputation of being the best mannered, handsomest, and cleanest students on our campus. I am disturbed that we might be losing that reputation. Accordingly, we shall expect all dental students to rally to the concept of a dentist as a professional gentleman, clean shaven, with short sideburns, clothed in clean garments. Your cooperation will be both expected and appreciated in your interest." And then at the end, he put a kind of a little threat that said, "I trust genuinely that all students will receive this communication in the cordial manner in which it is offered. Only my great esteem for our students prompts this message. I recognize there may be a high risk involved in a dean advising students what may be expected of them, but I'm taking that risk because of a long life contention that our School of Dentistry is without equal in all phases, including the personal qualities of our students." I have a feeling that that would probably eliminate a lot of your class. When I taught at NYU, I was in the oral medicine and orofacial pain department. The students had tattoos. They had neck tattoos. I think there was one guy that had a teardrop on his face. So, you know, things have changed a lot. But again, you guys have no idea what it was like. And you should be very grateful to have a dean like Dean Ismail, who has literally changed the entire culture. Because when I went there, it was literally like a 4-year fraternity hazing. We had to do projects like this. I can't believe that I found this. I still have this from 1968. It belongs in a dental museum. We had to carve things out of a block of plaster. I don't know if they still make you do that. but we had to take a block of plaster and carve shapes into it without breaking the plaster. And if you broke the plaster, you'd be out. It was just a crazy, crazy time. When I finally got out of school and I left Philadelphia, I never came back. I left that day vowing that I would never be back because the experience was so terrible to me. It damaged me in many ways. And you know, when you're a kid, they teach you that saying. They say, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never harm you, which is the furthest from the truth, because all the bruises that you got as a child healed up a long time ago. But every single one of us can remember something that someone said that hurt our feelings, someone or that hurt you in some way. That led many years later, that led to my first book. But I should say in my junior year of dental school is when I met Woody Allen. And I contrived a way to meet Woody Allen because I had been writing comedy all this time. It was the only thing that kept me sane, having to go through the stress of what I went through. And I got to meet him. He was starring in a play on Broadway, and I brought my writing to him. And again, I'm still stuttering, and my self-esteem is terrible because of the way I was treated. Very hard to have good self-esteem when people tell you that you're a disgrace to the profession because you have a mustache. I brought someone with me because in those days, my self-esteem wasn't good enough to know that I could show up on my own. I thought it depended on who I had with me to accompany me. So I got to meet Woody backstage, and I was just a kid. I didn't know enough to wait till the end of the show. I went during intermission. I was sending him notes on my dental school cards. When I went to school, I don't know if they still do, they gave us little cards to give to our patients, appointment cards. And I would, on my rare trips to New York, the first 2 years I couldn't come home at all because the work was so great. But in my third year, I started going back to New York on weekends, and I would go to the theater and I would leave a note on the back of my dental school card, and as if I was a friend of his. And I'd say, Woody, it's been a long time. I haven't seen you in a long time, and I'm coming to the show. And I must have saved up money for tickets because I had no money in those days. I was a poor dental student. And eventually I showed up. I got to meet him. He actually invited me back the next night, and he read through all of my material. And I had this dream that he was going to say, Jeffrey, let's do movies together. And that's not what happened. but he did say that he really liked what I wrote. He said, your stuff is very visual, and you should think of making a film out of it, which I did some years later, and it debuted at the Toyota Comedy Festival. But Woody Allen was the first very big star that I got to meet, and I've been with him a few times over the years, but that was like a very special moment for me. So when I graduated from Temple, I had to find a job. And because my self-esteem and my self-confidence was so beaten down, I was really nervous to look for a job as a dentist. And I remember getting a job in Medicaid. That was a big thing in those days. There were big Medicaid offices. Some dentists owned several of them. And I wound up running a Medicaid office in a really rundown neighborhood in New York City, in the Bronx. And it was in I don't know if you know about the South Bronx, but it's not a great place. And then it was really horrible. But I got along so well with the patients. I treated them the way people are supposed to be treated. When a patient comes to you, it's a great honor. And it doesn't matter how much money they have. These were all Medicaid patients. They were on welfare, but I treated them the same way I would treat anyone else. I treated them like gold. And I built up a big practice. I was running 4 or 5 chairs. And I started to get more confidence, having to undo all these negative experiences because I was really scared in the beginning. And after 2.5 years, I bought a practice from a wonderful dentist. He was only 54 years old, and he had a terminal illness. And he was looking for a young couple that he wanted to give the practice to that would practice the way that he did, because the practice was so important to him. And a lot of people were interested in it, but he chose me. I brought my wife to meet him. I was married at the time, which is why I had a wife. And I met with him, and we got along so well that he wanted me to take the practice, and he gave it to me at a ridiculously low figure. I was able to pay it off in about a year. And to show you how we manifest our worst fears, because I'm going to be talking about fear also and about confronting fear. But when I was in Temple, I was always nervous when I had to do surgery. When I went through the surgery department, my very first patient in my own practice, I had to extract a wisdom tooth. And it just shows you that whatever if you focus too much energy on something, you can manifest that, you can bring that into your life. And fortunately, the extraction went very well. But I wouldn't have chosen that as my very first patient if I had any choice. I spent 25 years there, and then I spent 12 years teaching at NYU, as I said, in the oral medicine and orofacial pain department. And I learned a lot of lessons. I learned, again, about changing thought. One of the things that we're going to be discussing is how to change your mindset from frustrating to enjoyable and from hate to love. I've had to do that so many times throughout the course of my life. I should mention also that while I was in practice is when my comedy career took off. The first big star I wound up writing for was Rodney Dangerfield, and he was doing my jokes on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. A lot of you might not remember him, but there are some of you more mature people who do remember The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And I got to write for a lot of big stars. And my nurse had strict instructions: never interrupt me while I'm working on a patient unless it's for show business. So, so she would come in and she would say, Dr. Gurian, I'm sorry, Dr. Lewis is on the phone. Dr. Rivers is calling. I wrote for Joan Rivers, and I worked with Richard Lewis from Curb Your Enthusiasm, and even Jerry Lewis. And there might be some of you who remember the name Milton Berle. I was in the Friars Club, which was a very esteemed show business organization. Milton Berle was known as Mr. Television because in the 1940s, when TV was very new, he had a show that was so popular that people actually bought televisions to watch his show. And he wound up being my sponsor in the Friars Club, which was a tremendous honor. And he would always talk to me about his teeth. He got a real kick out of the fact that I was a dentist because he was spending a fortune on implants in those days. And when I was writing for Joan Rivers, she didn't know that I was a dentist. I thought she knew because we had met at a Friars event, and her people contacted me and asked if I would write for her. And she invited me to her home. She lived in a palatial home on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And people didn't really treat writers that well, that they would invite you to their home. So I thought she knew that I was a doctor and that she was giving me that respect. So when I got to her house, the doorman said to me, you'll have to wait a few minutes because she just sprained her ankle and she's in a lot of pain. And I thought to myself, wow, that's great. I can write her a prescription for painkillers and I'll be a hero, because how many comedy writers can write a prescription for painkillers, right? So he finally said to me, okay, you can go up now. And she was there with a few people, and she introduced me to everyone as Mr. Gurian. So I realized that she didn't know. So I didn't say a word about it. We got along very well. She wound up hiring me to be her personal writer, which I was for quite a while. And one day I'm in my office and I'm working on a patient, and my nurse comes and she says, Dr. Rivers is on the phone. And it's Joan calling me from Las Vegas. And she said to me, what do you do during the day? And I said, I work. And she said, well, obviously you work. What is it that you do? And I had a feeling that she saw, because a lot of the news shows in New York City and also nationally were doing stories about me as a dentist who was writing for big stars. And I had a feeling that she knew. So I said to her, is this concerning the vicious rumor going around that I'm really a dentist? I said, you know, I've heard of accusing people of a lot of things, but that's really low. And she laughed and she said, how come you never told me? And I said, well, because no one hires you in show business because you're a dentist. They hire you in spite of the fact. It's not exactly a prerequisite to be in show business to go to dental school. So that's how it went. You know, I never told jokes to my patients. A lot of my patients would say to me, are you sure you're in comedy? Because you're so serious. Because I was always concerned that people would think that I wasn't taking my dentistry seriously. Because it was a dream of mine my whole life. It's all I ever wanted to be, really, aside from comedy. And I had some pictures on the wall of the celebrities that I worked with, but I didn't joke around. I don't think people want to go to a doctor who's telling jokes. Years ago, I dislocated my shoulder, and it was the worst pain that I ever had in my life. And I called my doctor, and I guess someone told him that you should tell jokes to your patients. And he said to me, don't make a habit of this. And I said to him afterwards, listen, if you tell jokes, it's not supposed to be while the person is in pain. You're supposed to do it afterwards. You don't tell someone with my arm was hanging out of the socket. I was in the most pain I had ever had until I had a kidney stone. That's another story. But I didn't tell jokes to patients. I encouraged an atmosphere of humor. I wanted my office to be the kind of place that people would look forward to coming to. And to this day, all these years later, I still get contacted by people who thank me for what I did for them, or who ask me for a recommendation of where they should go. When I left Medicaid and opened my own practice, there were people in that office on welfare who offered to pay to come to my office because they said they had never been treated that way, that well. And I'm not saying this at all to brag. I'm saying it to encourage that when you treat patients, that kindness is very important. It's such an important thing to make people comfortable. When I went to dental school, they actually said to us, never touch a patient, never shake hands with a patient. I shake hands with every patient. I thank them for coming in because, as I told you, I consider it an honor when someone trusts me with their health. You know, people are much more nervous to go to a dentist than they are to a physician. Once a patient trusts you, they'll stay with you for their whole life. Because people who fear dentists most of the time had problems as a child. They had an experience as a child that gave them fears. Because a lot of dentists who shouldn't have worked on children took it upon themselves to work on children. I used to work on kids 3 years old sometimes, and I'd give them an injection and they wouldn't even feel it. Because one of my goals was to administer local anesthetic that people didn't feel. I'd leave the topical in for 5 minutes. I go to dentists myself. They just swab on topical for 30 seconds and think it took effect. Take a little extra time with people. If a person doesn't know that you gave them an injection, they're going to be your patient for life. I've had people say, well, are you going to give me an injection? I'm like, I already did, you know, and you can do the same thing with children. So kindness is something that I can't stress enough, to treat people in a certain way. And when I was teaching at NYU, I have to say that with a lot of the students, it was very lacking. And I had to really go over that with them. We had a very multicultural group of students as well, you know, and some people's backgrounds don't open them up to things like that. You know, I would have patients very often, they would hug me afterwards. And I don't think you can just go and hug your patients on your own, but I think if a patient feels that and they want to give you a hug to thank you, then that's a wonderful thing. In spiritual groups, people always hug each other because it's a transfer of energy. And in upcoming lectures, I'm going to be talking about how I used energy to treat physical symptoms of stress that are linked to bruxism. You know, headaches and neck pain and facial pain and all kinds of things, just using the energy from your hands. But a hug is a very simple form of energy transfer. If you've ever been upset and someone that you trust gives you a hug and you feel better afterwards, It's because you allowed them to transfer that kind of energy to you, you know? And in Chinese, they call it qi, in Japanese, ki. In India, I think they call it prana. It's a real thing. It's an energy. It's the kind of thing where when you meet someone, sometimes you meet someone and they make you feel very comfortable right away, and that's real, or they make you feel very uncomfortable right away, and that's also real. You know, we get a sense. Animals do that great. They don't question it. As human beings, we tend to question it, but very often your first impression can be true. So there's this energy that we have between us, and it's very important to understand that and to use it in our work, because it can make people very comfortable. So when we got this lecture, you know, when I went to school and they said never shake hands with a patient, it didn't make sense to me. You know, the simple act of putting your hand on someone's shoulder, like for the last 20 years, I've been on the board of this group called the Association for Spirituality and Psychotherapy. And they're all classically trained psychotherapists except for me. And I approached them in 1999, and I told them about my background and about my work with people, because dentists are as close as you can come to psychologists. We're also artists. It's a very unique field. You know, there's almost no other field where we work so intimately with patients. We're actually holding their heads, we're cradling their heads. You know, all your thoughts come from your head. So we work very, very intimately with patients. And it's so important that we understand that we have an unusual opportunity. So again, when they said to me, never touch your patients, a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists are trained never to touch their patients. And because I didn't have that kind of training, I told them about my experience about taking away headaches from people. People who are very depressed and have emotional illness very often clench and grind their teeth. And we're going to get into this a lot more, and I think in the fourth lecture that I do. But it creates a lot of physical symptoms. And when I went to dental school, because of the stress that I was under, I thought I had lockjaw. I didn't know I was grinding my teeth. And you're going to find that a lot of patients that you get don't know that they're grinding their teeth. And during this time of COVID, a lot of dentists are reporting that they're getting so many people with cracked teeth, the cracked tooth syndrome, because people are stressed out. We're not used to living this way for 8 months. Unfortunately, I know too well. I was in the hospital in March. I had COVID, double pneumonia. I'll tell you about that too, about how I was able to get through that by changing my mindset. But I've had to use it throughout many things in my life. And so, again, when I approached the Association for Spirituality and Psychotherapy, they accepted my work. And I taught psychotherapists how to look for these symptoms that are coming from clenching and grinding the teeth. Bruxism has a tremendous effect on people. And you can't get somebody better with just a body and mind approach. It's not enough to just take pills or to give somebody an injection. It's a body, mind, spirit approach. And that's another thing that we're going to be discussing at another one of my talks. But a body, mind, spirit approach is very important to find out what it is, what are the stresses that are causing this person to engage in bruxism and to have these physical pains. And a lot of the facts behind that were what led to my first book. I've written 7 books. 5 of them were about the comedy world. The last 2 were my happiness series, and they're about thought, about the things that I'm going to talk to you about. And the first book was called Healing Your Heart by Changing Your Mind, a spiritual and humorous approach to achieving happiness. And it's got a picture on the cover of a meditating dog, which I think Joanne can appreciate. It's very hard to get a dog to sit in lotus position. And the healing your heart part is not about heart disease, although I used it to also survive a heart attack. I had a widowmaker heart attack, which is another crazy story. But I've had to learn to use my thinking to get me through some very difficult times. When I talk about heart wounds, which is a very big part of what I'm going to be talking about, since you're a kid, every time someone hurt your feelings or broke a promise to you or hurt you in some way, lied to you, broke up with you in a relationship, you carry that pain inside of you, in your heart chakra, and I call them heart wounds. And those heart wounds stay with you, and they affect your self-esteem, and they affect your self-confidence, and they affect every decision that you make in your life. Because every time you're called upon to make a decision, you use your thoughts to figure out what to do, right? Who else's thoughts can you use but your own? We tend not to listen to other people's opinion. We tend to think that we know. The smarter you are, sometimes the harder it is, because we tend to believe our thoughts. And if you notice the title of my talk tonight, it's Do Not Believe Your Thoughts, which is a strange thing to say to somebody. Don't believe your thoughts. But if you're carrying negative thoughts, and these are thoughts that were given to you very often by people who did not have your best interests at heart, or it could have been from your parents. A lot of parents, they mean well. They did the best they could. But some people's parents give them negative messages. They tell you that you're not enough. A lot of stutterers that I work with have that kind of background where they weren't given enough support at home. But it could come from anywhere. My experience in dental school did that to me. For 4 years of people, the day they gave me my diploma, the guy that handed it to me said, Gurian, get a haircut. And I was wearing a wig. I forgot to mention that. In order for me to get back in school after 3 weeks, my mother bought me a wig. And it was a flat wig with a part. As you can see, I don't wear my hair like that anymore. But she bought me a wig, and I went to a local barbershop in Philly and had them cut it. And I pulled on this wig, and I had to appear at that guy with the Confederate flag in his office. He had me appear in his office, and it wasn't enough to just show him. He had me turn in a circle, like a pirouette, so he could look at me from every angle. Now, I told you how many years ago this was, but I could picture it like it was yesterday, which is a great example of heart wounds. When people wound you that way, it doesn't go away that easily. It doesn't leave you. You have to work to overcome it. And I've worked all these years to overcome all kinds of things like that. But after he saw me, he said he didn't know it was a wig. He said to me, okay, you can go back into the clinic. Now, if you missed 3 weeks of clinic work, we had credits. We had to fulfill certain requirements in the clinic. And to be locked out of Crown and Bridge and prosthetics for 3 weeks was almost an impossibility to recover from that. I had to work so hard to make up the time that I lost. It's hard enough to just lose a couple of days, but to be banned from the clinic for 3 weeks was incredible. And I had, at the end of my freshman year, our project was to make a full set of dentures. And because I was kind of ostracized, which I still don't understand, I wasn't in one of the fraternities, so I had no place to do my lab work. When I went to school, we had to cast up our own partials even. We had to do all our own lab work, and we had to process our own dentures. So about 2 or 3 days before the end of the year, we had this whole year where we had to hand in a set of complete dentures. And one of the senior students took pity on me, and he brought me to one of the fraternity houses late at night so I could work on there, even though I wasn't a member. And he stayed up with me all night. Talk about kindness. And I processed those dentures, and when I opened the flasks, they were ruined. They had porosity. A whole year of work ruined, and I had maybe 3 days before I had to turn it in. And I was in a panic, and I didn't know what to do, and he didn't know what to do. And he sent me to another senior student the next day who taught me a technique called jumping the case. And I had to go back. I had to redo a whole year's project in 3 days while studying for a gross anatomy exam. The gross anatomy instructor let me sneak a human head out of the laboratory in a bag. I took a human head home to my apartment. That's how sick it was. And I only had one table. I ate on one end and I dissected the head on the other end while remaking this set of dentures. So you talk about stress and how I got through that, I have no idea. But it set me up for life in a way, because things happen in life that you couldn't possibly expect. At the last minute, obstacles occur. And if you're not ready to handle them, you could fall apart. I literally don't know how I did that as a young person to get through that kind of stress. But I made it, obviously, I made it. I was given the grace of having some kind of inner strength. And sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to call on your inner strength. So I was talking about making decisions and using your thoughts. A lot of our thoughts are negative. A lot of us are holding thoughts that are not valid for us. And there are thoughts that may have been given to us, as I said, by people who didn't have our best interests at heart. If someone said mean things to you, on some level, there's a tendency to question whether those things are true or not. When they told me that I would never be successful, this is accomplished doctors are telling me that as a young person. I had those thoughts in my mind. What if I'm never successful? What if I can't do this? And so I had to release myself. As you can see, I no longer stutter, right? So I worked on myself for years. Literally took me years to release the thoughts that I was holding that made me create a false disability for myself. There's nothing wrong with me. I can speak fine. I didn't change my genetics. I created this in my head. And a lot of us do that. We hold ourselves back. We don't allow ourselves to achieve what we can achieve. It's okay to be a superstar. You don't have to hold yourself back because other people gave you negative thoughts about yourself. The problem is that it's very hard to be objective about your thoughts, because if you have any intelligence at all, you tend to believe your thoughts. I'm looking for something that I wanted to read to you, and I don't see it right here, so I'll do it at our next lecture, but it's a statement about fear and allowing yourself to be who you can be. I had to learn why was I holding myself back? You're allowed to be successful. There's an abundance in the universe, and you're allowed to participate. You don't have to think, like when I was a kid, I used to make believe I didn't know the answer in school because I didn't want the other kids to feel bad that I knew the answer and they didn't. That was my sensitivity working against me. I didn't realize that if I showed that I knew the answer, that I could be an inspiration to other people. I wouldn't be a threat to them. I'd be an inspiration. That it's very important in life to honor your strengths. It's important to acknowledge your weaknesses also. But it's very important to honor your strengths in terms of building up your self-confidence and your self-esteem. So I conquered stuttering because I had to literally change my mind, which is, again, why this book is called Healing Your Heart by Changing Your Mind. I literally had to change all my thoughts. I had to eliminate the thoughts that weren't working for me. And as I said earlier, if you're intelligent, you tend to believe your thoughts. But the interesting thing is you created all of your thoughts. And your thoughts are not necessarily based on your experience. They're based on your interpretation of your experience, which can be very different. It's the reason why two kids can grow up in the same household and be two completely different people. You could have a sibling who's nothing like you, same parents, same environment, but if you ask them about their childhood, you'd think you'd have two different parents. Because the way you interpret the things that happen to you is very different. And if you're sensitive, which as I said is a great strength and not a weakness, but it feels like a weakness until you learn how to use it, your interpretation of things or of things that people said to you may be very different. So when I feel something, I'm an empath, which is something I had to learn, which comes in very handy when you're working on patients. Because I once had a patient say to me, I think you'd rather hurt yourself than hurt me. And I said, you're right. That's very intuitive, because painless dentistry was always really, really important to me, to develop techniques so that people wouldn't have to be afraid to come to my office. I wanted them to look forward to coming to me. That was always a really, really important thing to me, And again, so much of this is about thought. I wanna just glance at these notes for a minute to make sure that I didn't leave out anything. I talked about heart wounds. cellular memory is something that I didn't mention that I want to talk about briefly, because I want to leave time for people to ask questions if they do have any. But cellular memory is a very important concept that we're going to be going into, because what it means simply is that every single thing that's happened to you since you're born, everything you've experienced in your senses is still inside of you. It's the reason why you can hear a song that you like and it'll remind you of the boy or girl you liked in the 3rd grade. Or you'll smell a perfume and you'll be like, wow, my kindergarten teacher wore that perfume. And it takes you back in time. It's like a sensory deja vu. So every experience that you've had is still lodged inside of you. And unfortunately, trauma is lodged deeper than happiness. We all remember happy times, but again, you can all remember in terms of these heart wounds that I talk about, you can all remember something that someone said to you that hurt your feelings or hurt you in some way, or an experience, a traumatic experience that hurt you in some way. And those are the things that we need to work on to release and that we're going to be talking about. When I had my heart attack, it came out of nowhere. 5 years ago, I had been, I was a regular on Sirius XM radio, and I brought on special guests and friends of mine from the comedy world, like Russell Peters, who I'm hoping that a lot of you know who he is, a very dear friend of mine, and D.L. Hughley and people like that, who took time off from his tour to come in and be my guest on the radio. And by the way, being on the radio was an amazing thing. And it kind of, again, everything that I do, I use my voice, I speak. And I'm grateful every day that I no longer stutter. And I was telling you about cellular memory. So what cellular memory is that everything you've ever experienced is still lodged inside of you. And it's important that we try and observe our thoughts and see what thoughts that we're holding that are working against us. And try to tell ourselves that it's not true. So in order for me to stop stuttering, one of the things that I did was I made a list, a good and bad list. And I made a list of all the things that I liked about myself and all the things that I didn't like about myself. And no one's ever going to see this list. You do it in the privacy of your own room or whatever. And what you'll find is that if you're holding negative thoughts about yourself, to build up your self-esteem, your good list, all the things that you do like about yourself should far outweigh the things that you don't like about yourself. And in my books, I write about things like that. I want to inspire people to think differently, to go out and to be successful, to take the knowledge that you're gaining here at Temple and take that out into the world and do amazing things, because you have an amazing opportunity to do that. A very rare opportunity. And I think that I went through about all the stuff that I wanted to talk about. And I think we'll probably, Joanne, is this a good time to open it up for questions?
I think it's a great time. I think you've gone over so many different things, and for all who are on here, I think you probably could self-reflect and maybe think of yourself and what Dr. Gurian has said, and it would be wonderful to get the conversation going. So yes, we have about 10 minutes left.
Good. I just want to say that our next talk is going to be about the power of sensitivity and how to use it in your life. But if there's any questions that anybody has, I see someone wrote, didn't you put your name on the back of a Temple dental card? I put more than my name. I think you're referring to how I approached Woody Allen. Yeah, I said silly things to him like, Woody, I haven't seen you in a long time. I'm coming to the show. I'm bringing my cardboard thumb. I thought I had to say a lot of strange things to him in order to get his attention. And years later, I became very friendly with Woody Allen's manager, Jack Rollins, who said it was a very rare experience. What I didn't mention was I told you the story of my dental school experience, but I didn't tell you how I wound up here tonight, how kind it was that Dean Ismail contacted me last December or January to ask if he could meet with me in New York. And I couldn't imagine why he'd want to meet with me. And I wrote back to his secretary and I said, does he want to meet with me with the whole group? And she's like, no, just you. And I was nervous. I'm like, how can I get in trouble all these years later? What did I do? Because he wasn't the dean when I went there. But he said he wanted to meet with me. And when I told him my story, I brought my books of before and after pictures because I was a cosmetic specialist and I was very proud of my work. And I brought my books and I thought to myself, you know what, this could be a good opportunity for me to have closure after all these years, to be able to tell the dean of the dental school now what I had to go through in the years when I went there. And I thought maybe the universe is opening an opportunity for me that I could never even think, you know, there's a spiritual concept beyond your wildest dreams. This to me is beyond my wildest dreams, that I could sit across from the dean of Temple University School of Dentistry today and tell him what happened to me, how poorly I was treated all those years ago. And before I could finish my story, before I said the names, he was kind enough to say to me, they were racist and anti-Semites. And I said, thank you for saying that I didn't have to say that, because that was the atmosphere of the school these days. And all these decades later, to have this kind of closure, that I could come back and openly tell my story and tell you guys how different it is today and how grateful that you should be for the inclusion that's there and for the atmosphere that you get to work in is an amazing opportunity. That's why I started out by saying how grateful I was. And I don't know if any of you know Nick Kroll and John Mulaney, but they had a Broadway show called Oh Hello. And in New York City, there's an anti-crime group called the Guardian Angels. It was founded by a man named Curtis Sliwa. I used to be his dentist. I was the dentist for the Guardian Angels, and I was the dentist for the Hells Angels, believe it or not. And I was very glad that they never met in the waiting room because it could have been really bad. But Nick Kroll and John Mulaney asked me to open their Broadway show for them. And in the show, they mentioned the Guardian Angels, and they didn't know that I was friends with the Guardian Angels. They made me this jacket that says Gurian Angels. It's an exact replica of the Guardian Angels jacket. This was one of my greatest honors. So somehow I've been able to combine dentistry and comedy all these years. I'm still not sure how I did it, and I'm not sure how, but somehow it worked. And I got to work with not only the stars of yesterday, but also all the young guys from today that are on Comedy Central and YouTube and Instagram, and they're all friends of mine. And now I don't mind telling them that I was a dentist. I used to hide it, but now everybody knows. And a documentary actually came out about me in July. It's up on YouTube. If you go to Jeffrey Gurian documentary, you'll see it on YouTube. And it talks a lot about my experience at Temple and also at NYU. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the remaining minutes.
There's a couple of questions, Dr. Gurian, in the chat.
Yeah, they said, didn't Don DeLillo write about the Guardian Angels? They're in the Bronx. The Guardian Angels started in the Bronx. Curtis Sliwa was a night manager at McDonald's. He's running for mayor now of New York City, and hopefully he'll win. We need him. He's an anti-crime guy because New York is falling apart with this COVID thing. You know, and again, I was telling you how I survived this heart attack. I was back on stage in 5 days. I had a widowmaker heart attack. They had to put a stent in my heart. And I was joking with the surgeon on the operating table. I remember saying to him, I feel you in my heart, not in a romantic way, but I feel you, because I was feeling some pain and they were trying to unclog my heart and I was still awake. And he goes, I'll give you more anesthetic. So I was back on stage 5 days later, and the owner of the comedy club said to me, what are you, crazy? You just had a heart attack. And I was like, yeah, but it's hard to get a spot here. I don't want to lose my spot. And so I was able to do that through the power of positive thinking, changing my perception. When I was in the hospital in March with COVID double pneumonia, one of the worst experiences of my life, during the epicenter, New York was the epicenter of the virus at that moment. And I'm in a bed with 3 other very sick men, all with the virus. And I don't know if they were kidding or not, but they told me the guy next to me was from Wuhan, of all places. And he was coughing into the air. He didn't speak English. I had to call the nurse for him. I thought he was dying. He didn't speak English. And the nurse came and she took my hand and she said, "Don't worry, you're going to survive. You're going to be okay." And I got tremendous support from the comedy community. If you guys know Bill Burr, he was there, and Ron Bennington from Sirius XM announced it on the radio, and Jim Norton and Nick Kroll and John Mulaney. All these people rallied around me, and I got hundreds of messages. And I can't tell you, again, I'm not saying that out of ego. I'm telling you what support means. When you support people, when you show kindness to people, it's a very powerful thing. I'm a big believer in the power of prayer and the power of thought. And when so many people are focusing their energy on one thing, I really believe that it has an effect. And you can do this in a very minor way, one-on-one, when you're treating your patients, because believe me, they're picking up on your energy. And the energy that you put out is the energy that they're going to take in, you know? So I can't emphasize that enough. Let me see if there's anyone.
There is,
Oh, for NYU. Oh, I was, what hospital was I in? They took me to NYU Langone, which was great. And they were using hydroxychloroquine. And I don't care what anybody says, it saved me. I had started myself on Z-Pak. I was sick for 2 weeks before I had to call an ambulance. I had every symptom, but I could still breathe. And I think it was because I had started myself on azithromycin, because the first 2 days I was sick, I was sneezing and coughing, and I thought I just had a cold. And the 3rd day, it went to my throat. It was Friday the 13th of all days. It went to my throat. And as soon as I get a throat infection, I start myself on Z-Pak, because my throat gets infected really bad. And I was still just praying that it wasn't COVID. I just thought it was a cold. But as I got sicker and sicker over the days, I had a fever that was nonstop. And foolishly, and don't make this mistake, I had the kind of thermometer that my great grandmother in Russia would have made fun of. It was one of the old, it was like an old glass and mercury thermometer. I couldn't even read it. I didn't even know how high my fever was. All I knew that I was getting sweats at night, like fever sweats. And usually when you get that, your fever breaks. But with this, the fever came back. I had such chills that when I got to the hospital, they had to cover me with 4 blankets to stop my body from shaking. By the time I called the ambulance, I was bleeding from my nose. It was a nightmare, but I could still breathe. So they almost didn't come for me. They interviewed me on the phone about what my symptoms were, because so many people needed an ambulance. And I wanted them to take me to a hospital where my cardiologist was. And luckily they said, "No, we're taking you to NYU Langone," which is great because that's where I taught. And they were using, as I said, hydroxychloroquine and zinc sulfate and azithromycin, but they didn't have to put me back on azithromycin because I had stayed on it for 10 days. Luckily, I had 2 courses of it in the house. It's usually a 5-day course, but I took 2 different courses and I stayed on it for 10 days. And I really believe that that saved my breathing. They were concerned, you know, normal blood pressure is 120/80. My diastolic was 42 when I got to the hospital. My circulatory system was collapsing. They found it hard to get a vein. They put me in emergency, and a pulmonary specialist came. They took x-rays of my chest and my lungs. And he was the one who said to me, "I'm sorry to tell you this, you have COVID double pneumonia." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, that sounds like me. I don't do anything easily. Instead of single pneumonia, I had to have double pneumonia." On the radio, they said that I got it early because I always want to be the first at everything. So I caught it in March, the height of the pandemic. It was crazy. And when the ambulance crew took me home, they wrapped me up like a mummy. They put a sheet over my face. And I said, "Do me a favor, uncover my face, because in my building, they think I passed away if you wheel me in like that." And when they took me to my apartment and they took me inside, they saw all the pictures of the comedians, because my place is like a comedy club. They wound up staying for 20 minutes asking me questions about Kevin Hart and Jerry Seinfeld. And because Guys like Kevin came from Philly, by the way. Philly is a big comedy place. A lot of famous comedians came out of Philadelphia. I think Patrice O'Neill also did, and I was his co-host on the Black Phillip show. So anyway, let me see if there's any other
There's
questions.
2 more questions.
I've got a question.
There's a question about cellular memory.
Yes, what is the question? Oh, is it possible to access those memories whenever you like? You don't have a choice. That's what's interesting. You don't have a choice. We get triggers during the course of the day that elicit those cellular memories. So you could be going along and having a perfectly good day, and all of a sudden you feel sad. And you're not sure why. You probably passed something that triggers something inside of you. We're like video recorders. You know, I have affirmations all over my house. When I work with patients in pain, it's one of the things that I'll be discussing, my STAR therapy. The A in STAR therapy is for affirmations, to reprogram your thinking. But we take in everything that we see, even if you don't realize it. It's why, like, when you're dreaming, if you have dreams of people that you never met before, they're probably people that you passed by in the street during the day. So you'll get triggers. And I use this too when I work with people who stutter, because something will happen in the course of the day that will remind you subconsciously of something that happened in your past that caused you pain, that was a trauma to you. And then you'll respond, you'll remember something, and that's due to your cellular memory. But you don't have the ability to bring it back at will. There are people who have powers that can remember every day of their lives. I don't have that, but I experience cellular memory all the time. As I said, those simple examples, you could smell a perfume and you'll be like, wow, I know my kindergarten teacher wore that perfume. You know, it just takes you back right away. So it's very hard to control that, but you have to realize that if you're happy and you suddenly feel sad, that it's not something that you did, you're responding to a trigger. In order for me to stop stuttering, I had to control my mind to the degree where I would no longer let the trigger elicit the same response. You know, the definition of a habit is very often that you'll receive a trigger and it elicits the same response all the time. So I can still feel nervous about, you know, public speaking is everybody's greatest fear. And I do it all the time. It took me a long time to get the courage to go on stage to perform comedy, because it's a scary thing to do. But I challenge myself all the time. Last October, I made myself go to Japan all alone because I couldn't think of anything scarier. And it was crazy. I was lost every day in Japan, but I made it. You know, I teach myself that I can do the things that other people can do. They seem to be much easier than I can do. And that's a personal challenge that I give to myself about confronting fear, which is another thing that we're going to be discussing. Let me see if
Sorry, one more quick one. What's your favorite Rodney Dangerfield joke that you wrote?
You know, there was no PC in those days, so I'm afraid to say any of them. Let me see. He said, he said, well, let me see if I could do. I went to this custom bed shop. I said to the salesman, what kind of bed would you recommend for a guy like me? He said, single. A one-word punchline. Rodney loved that joke. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you one of the jokes that he did on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He used it as his opening line. Rodney had a lot of stock openings. I can't do a good Rodney impression. Michael Bolton does one of the best Rodney impressions I've ever heard. But he would say something like, I'm all right now, but last week was rough. You know, he said, I bought one of those whirlpools for my bathtub. The first night I used it, I lost 3 of my best ships. And he liked that joke so much that he paid me $250 for that one joke. And he used it with Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. That was his opening line. And comedians would always be very particular about what opening line they would use. So you can imagine how excited I was to sit home and watch that on TV. That was pretty amazing. By the way, you guys know Russell Peters, right?
Yep.
I can't hear him anymore.
Yeah.
Russell always said to me, if you ever, anytime you meet anybody from India or Pakistan, always ask them if they know me. So I'm assuming, I don't know if I should assume that that's your background, but he goes, always ask them if they know Russell Peters. Russell is, you know what? I refer to Russell as the Messiah of comedy because he brings everybody in the world together. He's an amazing person. And if you've ever been to one of his concerts, it's a very multicultural crowd and everyone is laughing together. And it's an amazing, and he imitates every accent, which these days might be frowned upon in some circles, but he's hilarious. And I really love him for that because I look at comedy as a healing force. And that's one of the ways I was able to combine it with dentistry because our profession is a very healing profession. As I said, it combines many things, medicine and artistry and healing. You know, it's a very, very powerful combination. Let me see if there's any other questions.
Ted has a question.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. The first I wasn't going to ask, but since you brought up Nick Kroll and John Mulaney, I have to ask if this is too much tuna.
Do you know that? Listen, I am the very first person to be pranked with too much tuna. They said it, you know. Yeah, I know it's crazy. I had no idea that I was going to be the first when they brought me out to LA to do this thing on Comedy Central with them. And when I first met Nick, he said to me, if I ever get a show, would you be on it? And I was like, sure, of course. And one day I'm sitting at my desk here and the phone rings and it's a production company from LA. And they're like, Nick Kroll wants to know if you would come out and be on his show. And I was like, absolutely. And so it was him and John as the Oh Hello Boys, you know, doing the too much tuna thing. So that's my claim to fame, is that I'm the very first person, and it's got over 1 million views on Comedy Central. If you go to my website, comedymatterstv.com, it's mostly comedy stuff. There's a lot of stuff on spirituality and healing and stuttering and headache therapy, but you'll see too much tuna. And then you'll see when they brought me back to do a thing with Katy Perry, and Nick Kroll was Caesar in that sketch, and it was really an amazing thing. So those guys have been incredible friends. When I was really sick, they rallied around me. So I'm glad you know about too much tuna.
Yeah, that's great. The second question is like personal reading list wise, like what are a couple of books that you would recommend reading, especially stuff regarding dentistry and we're going to be talking about bruxism and spiritual healing.
You know, I wish I could give you a better answer about that. The one book that I read that sticks out to me was a book that helped me a lot. It was called Are You Really Too Sensitive? Because I looked for years to find out what my sensitivity was about. I didn't know that I was an empath years ago. I knew that I could touch people and take away pain with my hands. And so can a lot of you. It's a gift that most of us have that we don't use or that we're not aware of. I knew as a child that I could do that. And I came across this book, and it's a really crazy story. I'll try to make it fast, but it's written by a woman named Marcy Calhoun, who's a psychic and an energy worker. And I had a friend whose brother was dying from AIDS, and he was in a coma. And he called me one night and he said, could you come to the hospital and try to do healing work on my brother? And I said, I've never done anything like that before for anybody, you know, for anything that serious. And he said, well, it can't hurt. He's in a coma. And I went to the hospital and I did what I do. I was working on his heart chakra to try to strengthen him. And they called me the next day and they said his chances went from 10% to 20%. Would you come back? And I was kind of shocked because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was working from my heart, you know, and I've taught people to do things like this if they're visiting relatives in the hospital. And I went back the next day and his chances went up to 30%. And I was really panicking. I was nervous because I didn't know what I was actually doing. I was working to strengthen him. And the next day, I couldn't go back. My dad got very sick and I had to go to see him in the hospital. And that weekend, I was overcome with a sadness that I had never had in my life. I felt hopeless. I couldn't explain. I didn't know what it was. And I found out that the young guy who was in the coma had passed away. And that day, my phone rings, and it's this woman, Marcy Calhoun, who wrote that book, Are You Really Too Sensitive? I had never spoken to her before. I wrote her an email 2 years before, telling her how much her book had affected me, and I never heard back from her. And she called me in that moment, and she said to me, she told me who she was, and I said, how could you know to call me? She goes, I'm a psychic, and I could tell that you needed this. Now, this is not the kind of story that you could tell to everyone. People would think you're insane. And she said to me, you're an empath, and you absorbed his pain. He felt like he died too young. He was only 35 years old, and he felt like he let down his family, and you absorbed his pain. Go to the funeral home and tell him that it's okay. So I did. The wake was that night, and I went to the funeral home, and I went to the casket, and I told him that it was okay. And my sadness was lifted. And it's a crazy story, but it's the truth. And so that book, I can actually say, affected me. Are You Really Too Sensitive by Marcy Calhoun. But that's what led me to write these 2 books. And because they became bestsellers, it means that the information is resonating with people. And 50 of those books were sent to Temple. Dean Nyquist has them. For the first 50 students that signed up for tonight, they get a free book. This book, Fight the Fear, Overcoming Obstacles That Stand in Your Way. Because there's a lot of information in there about changing thought and confronting uncomfortability. You know, when you first get out of school, you study for 4 years. Now you have to go out into the world. There's a lot of fear there sometimes about going into practice and how am I going to do this? And am I going to be successful? And where should I wind up? You know, and there's a big concept that you're always being guided, that you'll make the right choices, that whatever choice you make is the one that you're supposed to make, you know? And if you don't get what you're supposed to have, it's not because you're being punished. It's because you're supposed to have something better than that. And if you got the thing you wanted, you wouldn't be available for the really good thing that's coming to you. And I'm going to be discussing those. I think that's in lecture 3 when we talk about spiritual principles and how to incorporate that into our thinking. But this takes work. It doesn't happen overnight. The first time you hear something, you don't learn it. It makes sense to you. You may learn it intellectually, but it has to travel to your heart. And when you internalize it, when you take it into your heart, which is the strongest organ, the heart is more powerful than the brain. You know, so when you take it into your heart, that's the journey from here to here. When you internalize that information, then you can make it part of you. I see almost everyone has a beard. You guys would have been in a lot of trouble when I went to school. There would be no one left. I see one guy without a beard. Everyone, if you had to deal with a dean like I did, it was unbelievable. Someday I'd like to hear your feedback on that, about the atmosphere that dentistry used to be. Thank God it's changed, you know, because it was really a nightmare to have to go through that, like a 4-year fraternity hazing to become a doctor. I really thought that I would be welcome, that they would be so happy to have you. You know that, I'll tell you this last thing, we were learning to give local anesthetic. So, you know, when you first start giving injections to people, you're a little bit nervous. So I'm in the clinic, I'm giving an injection to a guy in the upper left quadrant. I have the needle in the gum and the instructor comes by and hits my elbow like that. And he says, put the needle in further. Now today, I'm sure that that would be considered assault. And he would probably, hopefully be arrested for doing something like that, because that's what it really was. But it shocked me to such a degree that somebody would do something like that. Thank God that I didn't injure the patient. But it's a ridiculous thing for somebody to do. And it's decades ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Those are the heart wounds that I talk about. So you have to be very careful what you say and think to people. You know, sometimes we have arguments and you say things that you don't want to say. You can't take back words. Once you've hurt somebody, it's inside them, you know? That's my temple story. Let me see if there's any other questions. I don't see any others.
I think we're good.
I just want to thank you all for showing up tonight and for engaging and for listening And I hope that something I said was helpful to people. And because that's the purpose of this. It's very enlightened for a dental school to have a speaker come in, not talking about dentistry and techniques, but talking about thought and how to lead your life in a more comfortable way. Because you can learn everything you want from books, but this is the kind of stuff that is helpful to lead a happier life. And that's all everybody wants. You ask anybody all over the world what they want. All people want is just to be happy, you know? So
I can say,
I thank you.
Dr. Gurian.
Dr. Gurian, I can say that on behalf of all the students who gave of their time this evening, I hope they'll join us and the faculty. But it felt so good to laugh, and I saw others laughing, and it's so important. It's such a good feeling. It's that happiness feeling in spite of all that's going on now, and that has gone on for all of us in the dental school and elsewhere. And it just felt really good to have.
Thank you so much. And I want you and Tal to stay on the screen next time, because the other people have their boxes blocked out, and it's very hard to do comedy and you don't see anyone's face, and you guys are laughing. And that
I was hoping that I wasn't laughing at the wrong points.
No, and that helped me so much. I haven't done any Zoom comedy shows for that exact reason, because I can't picture performing to a computer. You know, comedy is energy. You have to transfer energy between, and this is very hard. So you guys were a godsend to me tonight, because everybody else is blocked out. I don't see anybody. Just me and you two guys. So that was fantastic. I'm depending on you to keep showing up right in those spots.
Oh.
We'll do more next week. I wish you all a wonderful week. Stay safe. Wear your mask. And I'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Okay? Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching the Happiness Channel. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of it. If you want to see more of our videos, please click on the boxes on either side of me. And don't forget to like, comment, and most important of all, please subscribe. That's what helps us to do more videos. I hope to be doing one a week. And in the meantime, I wish you another week of happiness, and I hope to see you real soon. Thanks.